The barrel sat in the corner of the cabin, 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, filled to the brim with water. Every settler who visited looked at it, then looked at its owner, then shook their heads. Some laughed outright, others just walked away muttering about wasted space and foolish ideas. The barrel, they said, was the stupidest thing they'd ever seen in a frontier cabin. It was taking up valuable floor space. It was heavy, impossibly heavy, making the cabin harder to build and the floor more likely to collapse. It served no purpose they could understand. You couldn't store food in it. You couldn't use it for washing since the water never got emptied. It just sat there, a massive barrel of water, doing nothing. And there wasn't just one barrel. There were 6 of them. The man who built this cabin, the man who insisted on installing 6 enormous barrels of water inside his living space, was named Anders Petersen. He was a Dane, 52 years old, who'd arrived in Montana Territory in 1878 after spending 30 years working in Copenhagen as a civil engineer. He'd helped design heating systems for public buildings, calculated heat loads, and understood thermodynamics better than anyone within 500 miles. None of that impressed his neighbors. They thought he was a fool. The mockery started in the summer of 1878 when Anders first explained his cabin design to the other settlers in the Bitterroot Valley. He was filing a homestead claim like dozens of others, planning to build a cabin and prove up his land. But his cabin design was different, radically different, and the centerpiece of that design was water, lots of water. Specifically, 6 50-gallon oak barrels filled with water, positioned strategically inside the cabin where they could absorb and store heat. When he explained this to his nearest neighbor, a man named Samuel Hutchins, who'd been in Montana for 5 years, the response was immediate skepticism. "You're going to put barrels of water in your cabin? Why in God's name would you do that?" "To store heat," Anders said simply. "Water holds heat very well. Much better than stone, much better than wood, much better than air. If I fill barrels with water and warm them during the day, they will stay warm for many hours. They will release that heat slowly through the night, keeping the cabin warm even when the fire is low." Hutchins stared at him. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Water doesn't hold heat. It cools down fast. That's why you boil water for coffee and it's cold again in an hour." Anders smiled patiently. Water in a cup cools fast because the cup is small and thin, much surface area compared to volume. A barrel is different. Very thick walls, small surface area compared to the water inside. The water cools slowly, very slowly, and 50 gallons of water, it holds very much heat. More than you think. Hutchins wasn't convinced. "Even if what you're saying is true, and I don't think it is, you're wasting half your cabin space on barrels of water. Where are you going to sleep? Where are you going to put your furniture? Where are you going to live?" Anders had thought about this. "The cabin will be larger than normal, 20 feet by 24 feet. The barrels will be against the walls, they will not be in the way, and they will keep the cabin warm all winter with very little firewood. That's worth the space." Hutchins shook his head. "You're going to regret this. First winter in Montana, you're going to freeze because you filled your cabin with useless barrels instead of building it right." But Anders was not deterred. He'd spent months calculating heat capacity, thermal mass, and heat loss rates. He'd worked out the mathematics on paper, using principles he'd learned in his engineering training. He knew his design would work. He just needed to build it and prove it. Construction began in July of 1878. Anders started with an unusually robust foundation. He knew the weight of his water barrels would be substantial. 6 barrels, each holding 50 gallons of water, meant approximately 2,500 pounds of water alone, not counting the weight of the oak barrels themselves. That was over a ton of weight, concentrated in specific spots around the cabin. He dug foundation piers at each barrel location, going down 4 feet below the frost line and filling them with carefully stacked stones mortared with lime and clay. Each pier was capped with a thick oak beam that would distribute the barrel's weight across multiple floor joists. The floor itself was built heavier than standard construction. Instead of using 2-inch thick floorboards on joists spaced 2 feet apart, Anders used 3-inch thick planks on joists spaced just 16 inches apart. The joists themselves were thicker than normal, hewn from solid logs at least 10 inches in diameter. The result was a floor that could easily support the weight of the water barrels without sagging or flexing. The walls went up next. Anders built them from logs, but not in the traditional style. He used a double wall technique with an inner wall and an outer wall separated by a 1-foot gap. This gap was filled with sawdust for insulation. The total wall thickness was nearly 3 feet. This was excessive by frontier standards. Most cabins had single-thickness walls, maybe 8 to 10 inches of log. Anders's walls were 3 times that thick. The neighbors who watched the construction shook their heads. He's wasting lumber. He's wasting time. He's building a fortress when he needs a cabin. But Anders kept working. The roof was built with similar over-engineering. Heavy beams supported a double layer of planks with sod packed between them. The result was a roof with excellent insulation and significant thermal mass. The entire structure was being built to retain heat, to slow down heat loss, to create an envelope that would hold warmth for as long as possible. By late August, the cabin shell was complete. Then came the barrels. Anders had ordered them specially from a cooper in Missoula, specifying oak construction with extra thick staves and reinforced hoops. Each barrel cost him $8, a significant expense when most settlers were trying to build entire cabins for $50. The 6 barrels cost him $48, more than many settlers spent on their entire homestead setup. The investment drew more mockery. "He spent more on empty barrels than I spent on my whole cabin," one settler commented. "And what's he got to show for it?" A bunch of water sitting in his house. The barrel placement was carefully planned. 4 barrels were positioned along the south wall, the wall with the windows. These barrels would receive direct sunlight during the winter months when the sun was low in the sky. 2 barrels were positioned near the fireplace, 1 on each side, where they would absorb heat from the fire. Each barrel sat on a sturdy wooden base that distributed its weight to the floor joists below. Once positioned, the barrels were filled with water. Anders used a hand pump to move water from the nearby creek, filling each 50-gallon barrel to within 2 inches of the top. He left this space to allow for thermal expansion. As water heated, it expanded slightly, and he didn't want the barrels to burst. The filled barrels were then sealed with tight-fitting wooden lids. The lids prevented evaporation, which would cool the water, and prevented debris from falling into the water. The total water capacity was 300 gallons, weighing approximately 2,500 pounds. Combined with the barrel weight, the total was nearly 3,000 pounds, a ton and a half of thermal mass inside the cabin. The neighbors came to see the finished cabin. They walked around the barrels, tapped on them, shook their heads. Samuel Hutchins was among the visitors. He looked at the barrels, looked at Anders and said, "You've built a cabin around a bunch of water barrels. This is the most impractical thing I've ever seen. How are you going to live in here?" Anders gestured around the cabin. "There is room for a bed, a table, chairs, a stove for cooking, storage, everything I need. The barrels do not prevent me from living. They help me live better." "How?" Hutchins demanded. "They're just sitting there." "They do nothing." Anders corrected him. "They do something very important. They store heat. You will see when winter comes." Winter came early in 1878. By late October, nighttime temperatures were dropping below freezing. By November, daytime temperatures rarely climbed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. By December, the Bitterroot Valley was locked in deep cold, with temperatures dropping to 10 below zero at night and rarely rising above 20 degrees during the day. The settlers in the valley burned firewood constantly. A typical cabin required a fire burning day and night to maintain even minimal comfort. Most settlers were burning a full cord of wood every 10 days, sometimes more during the coldest periods. The labor of cutting, hauling, and splitting that much wood was exhausting and never-ending. Samuel Hutchins burned through his first winter's wood supply by early January and had to spend the rest of the winter cutting wood in brutal cold, a dangerous and miserable task. But Anders Petersen's cabin was different. He built a fire in his fireplace each morning, a modest fire that burned for 3 to 4 hours. During this time, the fire heated the cabin and, crucially, heated the 2 barrels positioned near the fireplace. On sunny days, which were common in Montana even in winter, the 4 barrels along the south wall absorbed heat from the sunlight streaming through the windows. The dark water in the barrels, visible through the wood grain, absorbed the sun's energy efficiently. By midday, the water in the sun-facing barrels was noticeably warm. By late afternoon, it was quite warm, perhaps 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The barrels near the fireplace were even warmer, sometimes reaching 90 degrees or more. Then, as the evening approached and the outside temperature dropped, the cabin began its nightly routine. Anders would let the fire die down to coals, then eventually go out completely. In a normal cabin, this would mean rapid cooling as the interior heat escaped through the walls, floor, and roof. But in Anders's cabin, something different happened. The water barrels, now warmed to 70, 80, or 90 degrees, began releasing their stored heat. The physics of this process are straightforward. Warm water, like any warm object, radiates heat to its surroundings. The wooden barrels, heated by the water inside, radiated warmth into the cabin air. This heat transfer happened slowly because wood is not a great conductor of heat, but it happened steadily, continuously, for hours. The 300 gallons of water in the 6 barrels represented an enormous reservoir of thermal energy. Water has one of the highest heat capacities of any common material. It takes 1 calorie of energy to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. For 300 gallons of water, that's approximately 2.4 million calories of energy storage for every degree of temperature. If the barrels were heated to 80 degrees Fahrenheit and cooled overnight to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a 30-degree drop, they would release approximately 72 million calories of energy. That's approximately 285,000 British thermal units, or BTUs. For comparison, a typical cabin might lose about 10,000 BTUs per hour to the outside environment in cold weather. Anders' well-insulated cabin lost less, perhaps 5,000 BTUs per hour. The heat stored in the water barrels could compensate for that heat loss for many hours, potentially through the entire night. The practical result was remarkable. While other cabins cooled rapidly after their fires died, Anders's cabin stayed warm. The air temperature in the cabin would drop slowly, a few degrees per hour, but it remained comfortable through the night. In the morning, when Anders woke, the cabin might be 60 degrees Fahrenheit, chilly but not freezing. He would restart the fire, warm up the cabin and the barrels again, and the cycle would repeat. The neighbors noticed that smoke rarely came from Anders's chimney. In a normal winter, every cabin had smoke rising from morning to night and through the night. But Anders's chimney smoked for only a few hours each morning, then went quiet. This worried his neighbors. Was he freezing? Had he run out of wood? Was he in trouble? Samuel Hutchins visited in mid-December, concerned that Anders might be suffering. He knocked on the door, expecting to find the cabin cold and Anders bundled in blankets. Instead, Anders opened the door wearing a simple shirt and trousers, comfortable and warm. The cabin interior was warm. Not hot, but genuinely warm. Hutchins estimated the temperature at around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked around in confusion. "Your fire is out. There's no fire burning. How is this cabin warm?" Anders smiled. "The barrels. They are warm from this morning's fire and from the sun this afternoon. They are releasing heat now. Feel them." Hutchins walked to one of the barrels near the fireplace. He placed his hand on it. The wood was warm, notably warm. He moved to one of the barrels along the south wall. Also warm, though not as hot as the fireplace barrels. "This doesn't make sense," Hutchins said. "Water doesn't stay warm this long. My water bucket freezes at night in my cabin. How is your barrel water still warm 6 hours after your fire went out? Anders explained. Your water bucket is small, maybe 2 gallons, much surface area compared to volume. Heat escapes quickly. My barrels are big, 50 gallons each. The water in the center of the barrel stays warm for many hours because it is insulated by the water around it and by the thick wood of the barrel. The heat comes out slowly, but it comes out all night. By morning, the barrels are cooler, but still warm. Then I make fire again, heat them again. Hutchins was struggling to understand. So you're only burning a fire for a few hours a day? Anders nodded. 3, maybe 4 hours each morning. On very sunny days, maybe less. The barrels store the heat. They release it slowly. I stay warm with much less wood. How much wood are you using? Hutchins asked. Anders had been keeping track. Perhaps half a cord every month, maybe less. Hutchins was stunned. I'm burning a cord every 10 days. You're using 1/6 the wood I am? Anders shrugged. Perhaps. My cabin is very insulated. The walls are thick. The roof is thick. Not much heat escapes. And the barrels, they store heat that would otherwise be wasted. When the fire burns, much heat goes up the chimney in a normal cabin. My barrels catch some of that heat before it can escape. They hold it. Use it later. Hutchins walked around the cabin again, looking at the barrels with new understanding. I called this stupid. I told everyone you were a fool. He paused. I was wrong. Word spread quickly through the valley. The Dane with the water barrels had figured something out. His cabin stayed warm with almost no wood. He wasn't freezing. He wasn't suffering. He was comfortable, possibly more comfortable than anyone else in the valley. And he was spending a fraction of the time and labor on firewood that everyone else was. Curious settlers began visiting, wanting to see for themselves. Anders welcomed them all, explaining his system patiently, showing them the barrels, letting them feel the warmth radiating from the wood. Some visitors were convinced. They understood immediately that Anders had solved a fundamental problem of frontier living. Others remained skeptical. It seemed like magic, and magic was usually a trick. There had to be a catch, but there was no catch. The system worked exactly as Anders said it did. The barrels stored heat. The heat released slowly. The cabin stayed warm. The wood consumption was minimal. It was simple, elegant, and effective. By January, several settlers were making plans to modify their own cabins, adding water barrels for thermal mass. One settler, a man named James Cooper, built 3 large barrels into his existing cabin, positioning them near his fireplace and along his south wall. He reported immediate improvement. His cabin stayed warmer with less fire. He was burning perhaps 30% less wood than before. Another settler, recognizing that he couldn't add heavy barrels to his existing weak floor, instead placed several smaller containers of water, 10-gallon pots and buckets, around his cabin near the fireplace. Even these smaller volumes of water made a noticeable difference. The water absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, smoothing out temperature swings. But not everyone could or would adopt the system. Some cabins were already built and couldn't support the weight of large water barrels. Some settlers didn't have the money to buy proper barrels. Some were too proud to admit they'd been wrong to mock Anders. And some simply didn't understand the principle well enough to implement it correctly. A few attempts failed. One settler put barrels of water in his cabin, but positioned them in corners where they received no sunlight and no heat from the fireplace. The water never warmed up, and the barrels did nothing. He declared the whole idea nonsense and went back to his original methods. Anders tried to help where he could. He visited settlers who wanted to learn, explained the principles, helped them calculate the right size and number of barrels for their cabins, and advised on proper placement. He emphasized the importance of insulation. The water barrels work best when the cabin doesn't leak heat. Thick walls, good chinking, minimal drafts. The barrels are only part of the system. The insulation is equally important. This advice was crucial. Some settlers installed water barrels but didn't improve their cabin insulation. The results were disappointing. The barrels helped, but not as dramatically as in Anders's cabin. They didn't understand that Anders' success came from the combination of thermal mass and excellent insulation. You need both. The scientific explanation for why Anders' system works so well lies in the properties of water and the principles of thermodynamics. Water has a specific heat capacity of approximately 4.18 joules per gram per degree Celsius, or 1 calorie per gram per degree Celsius. This is among the highest heat capacities of any common material. For comparison, stone has a specific heat capacity of about 0.8, steel about 0.46, and wood about 1.7 to 2.4, depending on type. This means that water can store roughly twice as much heat per pound as wood, and nearly 5 times as much as stone. For a given weight of material, water stores far more thermal energy. 300 gallons of water weighs approximately 2,500 pounds. If heated from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, a 30-degree increase, that water stores approximately 75,000 kilocalories of energy, or roughly 297,000 BTUs. To put that in perspective, burning 1 pound of dry wood releases about 7,000 BTUs. The heat stored in Anders's water barrels was equivalent to burning approximately 42 pounds of wood. But that heat wasn't consumed. It was stored and released. The next day, the barrels could be heated again, storing another 42-pound equivalent of wood heat. The insulation of Anders's cabin meant that heat escaped slowly. His 3-foot-thick walls with sawdust insulation probably had an R value of around 20 to 25. His roof, with its double layer and sod, probably had an R value of around 30. For comparison, a typical log cabin wall with 8-inch logs and basic chinking had an R value of perhaps 5 to 8. Anders's cabin lost heat at about 1/4 the rate of a standard cabin. This meant the heat stored in his water barrels lasted 4 times longer. The combination of high thermal mass from water and low heat loss from insulation created a system that required minimal energy input. A few hours of fire each day was enough to maintain comfort through 24 hours, even in severe cold. The temperature measurements tell the story. In a typical frontier cabin in Montana winter, when outside temperatures were 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior temperature with a fire might reach 70 degrees. After the fire went out, the temperature might drop 5 to 10 degrees per hour, reaching outside temperature within 8 to 10 hours. Anders's cabin, starting at the same 70-degree interior temperature, would drop perhaps 2 degrees per hour, taking 12 to 16 hours to reach uncomfortable levels. But because Anders restarted his fire each morning, the cabin never got that cold. The overnight low might be 60 degrees, still quite comfortable. The temperature differential was dramatic. On a night when outside temperatures were 0 degrees Fahrenheit, neighboring cabins without fires might cool to 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. Anders's cabin, without a fire, would be around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a 29-degree difference. His cabin was staying 29 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than his neighbors' cabins, all because of water barrels and good insulation. If you're enjoying this story about ingenious frontier engineering and want to see more tales of forgotten innovations that solved real problems with elegant simplicity, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the incredible techniques our ancestors developed. The fuel savings were equally impressive. Anders burned approximately 6 cords of wood during the 6-month winter from November through April. His neighbors burned 18 to 24 cords during the same period. Anders was using 1/4 to 1/3 as much wood. The labor savings were enormous. Cutting and hauling 6 cords of wood is hard work, requiring perhaps 30 to 40 days of labor spread across fall and early winter. Cutting and hauling 20 cords requires over 100 days of labor. Anders spent 70 fewer days cutting wood than his neighbors. That's 2.5 months of time available for other activities, for rest, for indoor projects, for anything other than the brutal, dangerous work of logging in winter. The economic impact was also significant. Firewood, while technically free if you cut it yourself, had real costs. You needed an axe, a saw, a way to transport the wood. You risked injury every time you felled a tree or split logs. You exhausted yourself, increasing food consumption and decreasing your ability to do other productive work. And if you didn't have time or ability to cut your own wood, you had to buy it. In Montana Territory in the 1880s, firewood cost about $3 to $4 per cord. Anders, burning 6 cords, had an annual heating cost of $18 to $24. His neighbors, burning 20 cords, spent $60 to $80. That $30 to $50 difference was significant money on the frontier, potentially 10% of a family's annual cash income. The environmental impact, though not discussed in those terms at the time, was also real. 20 cords of wood meant cutting down many trees. The forests around settlements showed the impact of firewood harvesting. Anders's lower consumption meant less pressure on local forests. Over years, over multiple households, the cumulative effect would be noticeable, but the most important impact was on quality of life. Anders lived in consistent comfort. His cabin was warm when he woke up. He didn't spend hours every day tending a fire. He didn't worry about running out of wood midwinter. He didn't exhaust himself with endless woodcutting. He had time and energy for other things, for reading, for projects, for simply living rather than just surviving. This improvement in daily life quality is hard to quantify, but was perhaps the most valuable benefit of his system. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was harsh, with temperatures frequently dropping below 0 Fahrenheit and several cold snaps bringing temperatures to 20 and 30 below. But Anders's cabin maintained comfortable temperatures throughout. The water barrels, heated during the brief sunny periods and by modest fires, continued to perform as designed. The system worked in all conditions. By spring of 1879, Anders had become something of a local celebrity. The crazy Dane with the water barrels was now the ingenious engineer who'd solved the heating problem. Settlers from across the region visited to learn his methods. Some brought bottles of whiskey as gifts. Others offered to pay for consultation. Anders declined payment but gladly shared his knowledge. He even wrote a short, technical pamphlet titled Efficient Cabin Heating Through Thermal Mass and Insulation, which he distributed for free. The pamphlet, written in clear English despite Anders's Danish accent, explained the principles of specific heat, thermal mass, and insulation. It included calculations for determining how much water mass was needed for a given cabin size. It provided construction advice for supporting heavy water barrels. And it emphasized the importance of insulation working together with thermal mass. The pamphlet was copied and recopied, spreading throughout Montana Territory and beyond. Settlers in Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas heard about the Danish engineer and his water barrel heating system. Some implemented variations of the design. The knowledge spread through the informal networks that connected frontier communities. Anders lived in his cabin for 38 years, until his death in 1916 at the age of 90. The cabin stood for another 20 years after that, eventually being dismantled in 1936 when the land was sold. The water barrels, still in good condition after 58 years, were salvaged. One was preserved and is now in the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena. The museum placard explains its significance, describing how Anders Petersen used water barrels as thermal mass to heat his cabin efficiently. Modern visitors often don't understand the significance. It's just an old barrel. But for those who understand the principles, it's an artifact of sophisticated engineering, proof that a single person with knowledge and determination could solve problems that baffled his community. The principle behind Anders's system, using water for thermal mass, is well established in modern building science. Solar hot water systems heat water during the day and use that stored heat later. Thermal mass, including water tanks, is a standard component in passive solar design. Modern sustainable homes often incorporate large volumes of water for temperature stabilization. But in 1878, on the Montana frontier, Anders was pioneering. He was applying engineering principles that most people didn't understand, using materials everyone had access to, solving a problem that affected everyone. His neighbors thought he was stupid. The water barrels seemed like a ridiculous waste of space and money. But Anders understood something they didn't. He understood that energy storage was just as important as energy production, that it was better to store heat efficiently than to generate it constantly, that thermal mass could smooth out temperature swings and reduce fuel consumption dramatically. These principles, which seem obvious once explained, weren't obvious to people at the time. The dominant paradigm was simple: burn wood to stay warm, burn more wood to stay warmer. Anders broke that paradigm. He showed that you could burn less wood and be warmer by working smarter, not harder. The comparison between Anders and his neighbors highlights the difference between knowledge and ignorance, between engineering and tradition. The neighbors were following the methods everyone had always used: build a cabin, install a fireplace, burn wood. These methods worked, after a fashion. People survived. But Anders, with his engineering background, understood that survival wasn't the only goal. Comfort and efficiency were also valuable. He designed his cabin not just to keep him alive, but to keep him comfortable with minimal effort and expense. The knowledge gap was significant. Anders understood thermodynamics, heat capacity, insulation, and thermal mass. His neighbors understood fire makes warm. This fundamental difference in understanding led to radically different outcomes. Anders's cabin was 29 degrees warmer, used 1/4 the wood, and provided dramatically better quality of life. The lesson is clear: knowledge matters. Understanding principles rather than just following procedures allows for innovation and improvement. The story also illustrates the pattern of ridicule, followed by acceptance, that often accompanies innovation. The same people who mocked Anders's water barrels in summer were praising them by winter. The same neighbors who called him stupid were asking him to teach them by spring. This pattern repeats throughout history. New ideas are ridiculed, then tested, then accepted, then adopted, then taken for granted. Anders' water barrels went through all these stages, from ridiculous novelty to accepted practice in the span of one winter. The modern applications of Anders' principle are widespread. Passive. Solar homes use water walls, large tanks of water positioned behind south-facing glass to store solar heat. Some designs use water-filled tubes or cylinders arranged vertically. Others use large tanks in basement or utility spaces. All are based on the same principle Anders demonstrated. Water stores heat efficiently and releases it slowly. Green buildings use thermal mass for temperature stabilization. High-mass construction, using concrete, stone, or water, smooths out daily temperature swings, reducing the need for mechanical heating and cooling. The building itself becomes a battery for thermal energy. Off-grid homes often incorporate water tanks as heat storage. Solar collectors heat the water during the day. The hot water can be used directly for washing or showering, or it can serve as space heating, radiating warmth into the living areas. Some systems use both. These modern systems are more sophisticated than Anders's barrels. They use insulated tanks, circulation pumps, and control systems. They achieve higher performance and greater efficiency. But the core principle is identical to what Anders demonstrated in 1878. Heat water when energy is abundant, store the heat, release it when needed. The simplicity of Anders's approach is worth emphasizing. He used oak barrels, readily available. He filled them with water, freely available from the creek. He positioned them for solar gain and near his fireplace. He built a well-insulated cabin to retain heat. That's it. No complex machinery, no expensive materials, no advanced technology, just barrels of water and understanding of how heat behaves. This simplicity made the system robust. There was nothing to break. The barrels didn't require maintenance. The water never needed replacing. The system worked year after year, decade after decade, with zero upkeep. Modern systems, with their pumps and controls and sensors, are more efficient but also more complex and prone to failure. Anders's system was bulletproof. The scalability is also interesting. Anders used 6 50-gallon barrels, 300 gallons total, for his 20 by 24-foot cabin. Someone with a smaller cabin could use fewer barrels. Someone with a larger cabin could use more. The principle scaled up and down. A small one-room cabin might need only 2 or 3 barrels. A large family home might need 10 or 12. The system adapted to different needs and situations. Some settlers made modifications based on their specific circumstances. One family, living in an area with limited sunlight due to surrounding mountains, positioned all their barrels near the fireplace rather than along the south wall. They relied entirely on fire to heat the water, not solar gain. The system still worked, though not as efficiently as Anders' solar-assisted version. Another settler, working with a very small cabin, used several 10-gallon containers instead of large barrels. Smaller containers were easier to fit into tight spaces and didn't require as much floor reinforcement. The total water volume was less, but even 50 to 75 gallons provided noticeable benefit. These variations showed that Anders's core insight, using water for thermal mass, could be adapted in many ways. The specific implementation mattered less than understanding the principle. Before we continue with the rest of this remarkable story, if you've been fascinated by this forgotten engineering solution and want to discover more incredible innovations from frontier America, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. There are so many more stories of ingenuity waiting to be told. The long-term influence of Anders's work is difficult to trace precisely. How many settlers adopted his methods? How many cabins in Montana and neighboring territories used water barrels for heating? The exact numbers are unknown, but references to the practice appear in various sources from the late 1800s. A homesteader's guide published in 1885 mentions water barrels as an option for cabin heating. A territorial newspaper article from 1887 describes a settler's cabin heated primarily through thermal mass. Multiple personal diaries and letters from the period reference the technique. The knowledge clearly spread and was adopted by at least some portion of the frontier population. But the practice also declined. By the early 1900s, cast iron stoves were becoming more common and affordable. These stoves were more efficient than open fireplaces and required less fuel. Coal was becoming available, providing more heat per pound than wood, and the frontier was closing. More people lived in towns with nearby wood supplies. The pressure to minimize fuel consumption decreased. The elaborate water barrel systems weren't as necessary when fuel was cheap and abundant. The knowledge faded. By mid-century, few people remembered the technique. Anders Petersen became a forgotten figure, his innovations lost to history. But knowledge has a way of resurfacing when conditions make it relevant again. The energy crises of the 1970s sparked renewed interest in energy-efficient building and alternative heating methods. Architects and engineers rediscovered thermal mass and passive solar design. Some of these modern practitioners independently developed water-based thermal storage systems, not knowing that Anders had demonstrated the same principles a century earlier. Others researched historical building methods and found references to frontier cabins heated with water barrels. Anders's name occasionally appeared in this research, though often without much detail. In recent years, the off-grid and sustainable living movements have embraced thermal mass as a key principle. Modern homesteaders building in cold climates often incorporate water storage into their heating systems. Some use modern materials like IBC totes, large plastic containers that hold around 275 gallons. Others use custom-built water walls or water floors. The specific implementation varies, but the principle is the same as Anders demonstrated. Use water to store heat. Use insulation to retain heat. Minimize fuel consumption. Live more sustainably. The 29-degree temperature difference that Anders achieved, his cabin staying 29 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than his neighbors' cabins, was the result of two factors working together. The water barrels provided thermal mass, storing heat. The excellent insulation prevented heat loss. Neither factor alone would have produced such dramatic results, but together they created a system that dramatically outperformed standard frontier construction. This integration of multiple elements, thermal mass plus insulation plus smart positioning plus solar gain, was the real genius of Anders's design. He didn't just add water barrels to a standard cabin. He designed an integrated system where every element supported the others. Modern building science recognizes this holistic approach as essential. High-performance buildings aren't just well-insulated, or just solar-oriented, or just high mass. They're all of these things working together. Anders understood this integration instinctively. He designed a system, not just a collection of features. The mockery Anders endured during construction must have been difficult to bear. He was 52 years old, far from his homeland, building a cabin in a foreign wilderness. He was confident in his knowledge, but human beings still feel the sting of ridicule. Every neighbor who called his barrels stupid, every visitor who laughed at his design, every skeptic who predicted failure, these moments must have been challenging. But Anders persisted. He trusted his calculations, his experience, his understanding of thermodynamics. He built what he knew would work, despite the mockery. This confidence in the face of skepticism is a hallmark of innovation. New ideas are almost always ridiculed initially. People are comfortable with familiar methods and suspicious of change. The innovator must have the courage to proceed despite skepticism, must trust evidence and logic over popular opinion. Anders had that courage. He built his supposedly stupid water barrels, and they worked exactly as he'd calculated. The vindication must have been sweet, not because Anders was petty or wanted to prove others wrong, but because evidence had triumphed over ignorance. The cabin worked, the math was right, knowledge had won. The neighbors who'd mocked him now asked for his help. This transformation from ridicule to respect validated not just his specific design, but his entire approach of applying engineering principles to frontier problems. The broader lesson from Anders' story is about the value of expertise. Anders wasn't just any settler. He was a trained civil engineer with 30 years of experience designing heating systems. He brought specialized knowledge to a frontier that desperately needed it. But that knowledge was initially dismissed because it contradicted local tradition. The frontier culture valued practical experience over formal education. Book learning was often viewed with suspicion. Real knowledge came from doing, not reading. But Anders's story shows the limitation of this view. Practical experience is valuable, but specialized knowledge is also valuable. Engineering principles, mathematical calculations, understanding of physics, these tools allowed Anders to design something far better than traditional methods could produce. The ideal approach combines both: respect for practical experience and respect for technical knowledge. Anders had both. He understood theoretical thermodynamics, but he also knew how to build with his hands, how to work with available materials, how to adapt designs to frontier conditions. This combination of theory and practice made him uniquely capable. Modern society has largely accepted the value of technical expertise. We trust engineers to design bridges, trust architects to design buildings, trust specialists to solve complex problems. But in Anders's time and place, that trust hadn't been established. He had to prove his expertise through results. The water barrels that stayed warm all night, the cabin that stayed 29 degrees warmer, these results proved his expertise more effectively than any credentials could have. The preservation of Anders' story is somewhat accidental. He wrote his pamphlet, which survived in a few libraries. He was mentioned in some newspaper articles. One of his water barrels was saved, but easily the story could have been completely lost. If the barrel hadn't been preserved, if the pamphlet hadn't survived, if no one had written about him, Anders Petersen and his ingenious heating system might have vanished from history entirely. This near loss highlights the fragility of knowledge. If it's not actively preserved, documented, and transmitted, it disappears. How many other Anders Petersens existed, solving problems ingeniously only to be forgotten because no one recorded their work? We'll never know. The stories are gone. This makes preservation efforts important. Museums that save artifacts like water barrels, archives that maintain old pamphlets and newspapers, historians who research and write about forgotten innovators. All of these efforts keep knowledge alive. Anders' story survives because enough pieces were preserved for researchers to reconstruct what he did. For modern readers, the question is, what can we learn from Anders Petersen? Several lessons emerge. First, understand principles. Don't just follow procedures. Anders understood heat transfer, not just how to build a fire. This understanding allowed innovation. Second, question assumptions. Everyone assumed you needed constant fire to stay warm. Anders questioned that assumption and found a better way. Third, integrate multiple solutions. Anders didn't just add water barrels or just improve insulation. He did both, creating a system greater than the sum of its parts. Fourth, trust evidence over opinion. Anders's calculations said the system would work. His neighbor's opinions said it wouldn't. He trusted the math, and he was right. Fifth, share knowledge freely. Anders taught everyone who asked and wrote a pamphlet for wider distribution. This generosity spread his innovations and helped his entire community. These lessons apply far beyond cabin heating. They're principles for innovation in any field, any problem, any challenge. The stupid water barrels weren't stupid at all. They were brilliant. The cabin that stayed 29 degrees warmer wasn't lucky. It was engineered. The man who endured mockery wasn't a fool. He was a genius who saw what others missed. Everyone mocked his stupid water heat barrel until his cabin stayed 29 degrees Fahrenheit warmer all winter, used 1/4 the firewood, and provided comfort that his neighbors couldn't imagine. Then the mockery stopped. Then the learning began. Then the innovation spread. That's how progress happens. Not through instant acceptance of new ideas, but through demonstration of results. Not through popularity, but through evidence. Not through tradition, but through understanding. Anders Petersen understood that water could store heat. He understood that insulation could retain heat. He understood that combining both would create something better than anything his neighbors had seen. He was mocked for that understanding. Then he was vindicated. Then he was celebrated. Then he was forgotten. But the principle remains true. Water stores heat. Insulation retains heat. Knowledge produces results. And sometimes the person everyone calls stupid is the only one who's actually thinking clearly. The 6 barrels of water sitting in that Montana cabin, keeping a Danish engineer warm through harsh winters, represent more than just an interesting historical anecdote. They represent the power of applied knowledge, the value of engineering thinking, and the courage required to build something new when everyone says it won't work. They stayed warm all night. They kept the cabin 29 degrees warmer. They used 1/4 the firewood. They proved the skeptics wrong. And they remind us that innovation often looks stupid until it succeeds. Then it looks obvious. Anders Petersen's water heat barrels were stupid. Until they worked. Then they were genius. That's the story. That's the lesson. And that's why the stupid water barrels deserve to be remembered.